Good morning and welcome. My name is Matthew Tisdale, Executive Director with GridWorks. We're pleased to welcome you to the third of 3 webinars on transmission planning and cost allocation in the West. We have been having a good time and learning a lot through these webinars. Want to thank all of you who have been able to participate through the stages. And welcome those of you who haven't had a chance to be here before. These webinars are a part of the Western States Transmission Initiative, and I wanted to begin by just providing a short overview of those. Then we're going to introduce our speakers and get right into the meat of the day. What is the Western States Transmission Initiative? This is a collaboration between GridWorks and CREPC, focusing on transmission planning and cost allocation. We're asking big questions like, is the current approach to transmission planning and cost allocation sufficient in the West? What changes might be helpful? What is the appropriate role for state regulators and energy officials? We have been gathering input and insight into those questions through interviews of state officials, utilities, non-governmental organizations, tribes, and other stakeholders throughout the West. The current number is around 35 interviews have been completed. And we are using those insights to support conversations among a small group of commissioners working as a working group to consider these questions and develop a set of recommendations for the broader CREPC community to consider at their October meeting in Seattle. In parallel with the development of those recommendations and the consideration of those questions by that working group, we have hosted these 3 webinars, first on July 20th, focusing on transmission planning, then on July 27th, asking the question, is more transmission necessary for the West and what would be the barriers? We've been very fortunate to have some of the luminaries in Western transmission and national transmission issues to help with those. And today is also no exception. We have amazing presenters and insightful folks here to help us with that today, as well as we focus in on transmission cost allocation. So we're going to have a 3-part discussion today. The first part is going to be led by Rich Glick, who's going to provide this brief overview of transmission cost allocation, primarily from a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission point of view. Then we're going to turn to our next presenter, that is Jeremiah Donor from the MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. Jeremiah has been with MISO for about 16 years. And has been a fundamental implementer of this framework and really is unparalleled expertise, I think, in how this works. So we're really lucky to have Jeremiah. We welcome you, Jeremiah. After Jeremiah is finished, we're going to transition to Lauren Azar. Lauren has been involved in the industry for probably longer than she cares to admit, working at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. At the state level, she served as a commissioner to the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, where she also had the privilege of leading the organization of MISO states as they set up their current approach to transmission planning and cost allocation. So between former chair for Rich Glick, and Jeremiah at MISO and Lauren in her role setting all this up, we have a wealth of experience and perspective here to lean on. And I want to begin by thanking you 3 for being with us to help with that today. Unless there's any questions from you 3, we'll just jump in and I'll turn the floor over to Rich.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and welcome back to everybody for the 3rd webinar. Today we're talking about cost allocation, which I think may be one of the most, if not the most controversial aspect of transmission development. And if we could start with the next slide, please. I'm going to be very quick and just be brief, less than 10 minutes, and then we'll pass it on to both Jeremiah and Lauren to hear a lot about what's going on in MISO, which I think is a good example for everyone around the country. when we talk about cost allocation, that's kind of a mechanistic term. I think really the question is, how is transmission paid for? How much and who pays for it is really the questions, and how do people figure that out? There's a lot of different ways that we approach cost allocation. When I say we, utilities around the country, regulators, both state and federal. Generally, if a utility builds a transmission project, and that utility is a vertically integrated status in most of the country, obviously most of the West, outside of California, the utility is assigned the cost of all that, the whole transmission, and essentially recovers those costs pursuant to bundle rates. If the transmission project is built by a utility that's not a vertically integrated state, FERC does have oversight over those transmission projects, and essentially the utilities generally recover those costs pursuant to some formula rates at FERC. And then, of course, for projects that are jointly developed, typically utilities agree to a cost sharing approach. FERC actually permits that, and it's a simpler way to go than having the regulator determine how much gets 50%, how much gets the other 45%, who gets 5%. Utilities share the project. They generally work it out amongst themselves. And then, of course, there's merchant transmission, which is quite prevalent in the West. Those are projects developed by private entities that aren't necessarily the costs are not necessarily recovered pursuant to rates. They're at least directly. It's usually the cost of those particular projects are recovered pursuant to a subscription model. You build a transmission line, or you have an open season. People sign up for the use of that particular transmission line, and they pay for that accordingly. And then comes probably the more controversial aspect, and that is regionally planned transmission projects. I think we spent a little time on the last webinar, I think, talking about, or maybe the first webinar, talking about FERC order number 1000. Its requirement that that transmission be planned, or some transmission projects be planned regionally around the country. To the extent a transmission project is planned pursuant to a FERC regional entity, such as Northern Grid or West Connect or California ISO, then that particular transmission project, the costs associated with that are allocated pursuant to methodologies that FERC has to approve that are proposed by the regions themselves. And then, as an alternative to using the FERC Order 1000 cost allocation methodology, the so-called state agreement approach, and we've seen it actually in New Jersey recently, where one state or several states can agree amongst themselves and essentially bypass the FERC cost allocation methodology. And we're going to hear a lot more today about MISO and the agreement that was reached among a number of states to divvy up the cost of a number of very important transmission projects. And then when it comes to, there are other methodologies as well with regard to figuring out cost recovery for network upgrades that are built as a result of request to interconnect a generator, request to interconnect to the grid. Generally, at least for its FERC policy, that participant funding be utilized. Essentially, that means that the generator must pay for those network upgrades. In some cases, the generator receives transmission credits. Other times it doesn't. But essentially, the FERC policy today is that regardless of who benefits from that particular line, the generator causes that project to be, the network upgrade to be built. The generator has to pay for that. And as we're going to talk about more in a little bit, what's really becoming more evident as additional transmission projects are planned in terms of multi-state transmission projects, high voltage lines that cross significant number of miles. That's where the controversy exists of how do you divvy up the cost associated with that, who gets allocated the cost associated with that, especially when there are multiple beneficiaries. And if we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about FERC Order 1000. FERC is required by law pursuant to, there's been a number of court cases that essentially say FERC must ensure that when it oversees the allocation of these multi-benefit projects that are this big transmission project where FERC has jurisdiction over, must ensure that the rates, that the costs associated with that are allocated in a manner that's commensurate with benefits. That doesn't mean you have to figure out exactly how much each customer benefits and allocate the cost accordingly. It has to be roughly commensurate is really what the courts have said, but that's still very difficult and it's very constraining on FERC in determining which are what benefits are we looking at here and who's benefiting how much. And that's a difficult process. As I mentioned earlier, regionally planned projects, each region already currently has an approved cost allocation methodology. but also exists with regard to neighboring regions. If there's interregional transmission planning, there aren't many projects that actually are developed this way. But if there were, between different regions of like, for instance, MISO and PJM, for instance, or Northern Grid and West Connect, there would be a separate cost allocation methodology for projects that cross both regions. And as I said earlier, FERC essentially defers to the regions to define what the benefits are. FERC's not going to say, these are the 12 benefits you need to take a look at. The commission has been very deferential and say, parties in a region, whether it be Northern Grid or West Connect or any other region around the country, you figure out what those benefits are, and then come back to us with the proposed cost allocation methodology. And then FERC determine whether those costs are allocated. The cost allocation proposal that you made ensures that the benefits are addressed sufficiently. So I mentioned the state agreement approach, and that's actually, I'll get to more of that in a second. And then what's a very important issue for the West, and this is becoming increasingly important, is based on a couple of court cases, non-jurisdictional utilities to FERC. So for instance, the Bonneville Power Administration, WAPA, the big municipal and cooperative utilities, Salt River Project, City of Seattle, those utilities in the West, while they might benefit from a particular project, or customers might benefit from a particular transmission project, FERC doesn't have any authority to require that those utilities pay from a cost allocation methodology for a particular transmission project is built, planned for and built on a regional basis. And that's very limiting and has made it very difficult for transmission projects to go forward, because the type of entities that FERC does have jurisdiction over, investor-owned utilities primarily, would have to take 100% of the cost of a particular project, even though they may not benefit 100% in a similar manner, meaning that there'll be other beneficiaries as well. Next slide, please, Matthew. And so I just wanted to leave you, before we get into the MISO example, just with a couple of thoughts here. First of all, and we've talked about this in the previous webinars, there is certainly a growing need around the country, but also in the West, for transmission projects that are longer in distance, higher voltage, in many cases cross many utility service territories. And so in the past, it was relatively easy. If one utility built a transmission line to serve its customers, that's a relatively easy approach to figuring out cost allocation. When you're building longer lines that cross many different utility service territories, you have potentially a number of beneficiaries. How do you divvy up the costs? How do you figure out what the benefits are? That's becoming more difficult as we move forward. And then, as I just mentioned a second ago, in the West, there's a real question: is it even possible to plan for and build regional projects if you have non-jurisdictional utilities that are exempt from cost allocation? They can volunteer to pay, and if they, but without an RTO, without joining an RTO, unless they volunteer to pay, they don't have to pay. And that makes it difficult for everybody else. The FERC, as I spoke at the first webinar about, FERC has proposed, and it's still a pending proposed rule, changes to the way it requires under Order 1000 for transmission to be planned, and also for the cost to be allocated. But FERC has said, the states have an important interest here. Why don't we figure out a way pursuant to the state agreement approach for the states maybe the states could figure out on their own how best to allocate costs, whether it be ex ante, essentially beforehand, have some sort of methodology that would be applied to all regionally planned transmission projects in that particular region, or ex post on a case-by-case basis. If you pick a particular transmission line or a group of transmission lines that we're going to hear about in MISO, the states would get first crack at trying to figure out what those cost allocation methodologies should be. The states don't agree, and that's certainly a possibility. It's difficult sometimes, the broader the region is, to get different states to agree. Then the issue goes back to FERC, but at least the idea would be for the states to first have a sense of how to divvy up the cost among the various states and obviously figure out the benefits as well. The NOPR also includes a number of benefits, a much broader list of benefits than I think transmission planners have looked at in the past to assess cost allocation. But again, FERC doesn't require a particular level or types of benefits to be utilized. It just says these are the ones you should consider taking a look at when you determine how to divide costs. And that's actually becoming more of an issue. It's a lot easier, and we'll hear more about it in a second, but it's a lot easier to put dollar terms in certain benefits like lower cost, lower energy costs, reducing congestion, When you improve reliability, how do you figure out, how do you put a dollar value on that, and how do you figure out which customers benefit and which don't? That's going to be an important issue going forward. And I think we're going to hear today, I know we're going to hear today from two experts, both Jeremiah and Lauren, about how MISO has approached this, which is very interesting and may provide a model for the rest of the country. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremiah, for who's with MISO.
Thank you, Rich. Let me pull up my slides and we'll get started.
Jeremiah, while you're getting your slides up, I just want to mention to the folks on the webinar, questions are welcome throughout. Please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to share your questions with us. We have time set aside after the presentations for discussion. We may integrate your questions as we go or hold them for that time. Rich will be navigating those waters, but we want to encourage your participation and welcome those questions.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Just to confirm, able to see my slides, Matt?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Jeremiah Donor here for MISO. I'm the Director of Cost Allocation and Competitive Transmission here at MISO. As Matt said, I've throughout my career at MISO, I've spent a lot of that time working in transmission planning and cost allocation. So I came into MISO as an economist, and they said, you know what, transmission cost allocation would be a great thing for you to work on. And so I've over the years spent a lot of my time thinking about working with our stakeholders and states on transmission cost allocation, and in particular have really been involved in over those years our development and further refinements, enhancements of our multi-value project cost allocation, which really will be the focus of today's discussion. So I know we're really gonna focus around transmission cost allocation, but you really can't think about transmission cost allocation without also thinking about the transmission planning process, and really how that transmission planning process informs that transmission cost allocation. And so as I kind of walk through overall MISO's cost allocation approaches, and in particular our multi-value project cost allocation, I'll really try to highlight how we use our planning process to inform that cost allocation. And then going to Lauren's discussion, that ultimately is really how we ultimately get that agreement amongst the states, is how we use that planning process to show the benefits and who's benefiting, and ensure we get that ultimate outcome where we are able to clearly demonstrate that we got benefits in excess of costs. So, you know, Rich talked about that roughly commensurate standard, and really trying to ensure that if we're spreading costs across a large portion of our footprint, ensuring we have that roughly commensurate cost allocation to go with who's benefiting from those projects. So MISO is currently where we're at in thinking about this, resource transition that the whole country is seeing, right? Across the country, we're seeing unprecedented change in our resource fleet. It's happening at a pace that we've never seen before in the utility industry. And so MISO has been thinking about this for a number of years now, and we call it our MISO's reliability imperative. And that's really focused on how do we ensure reliability given this resource change that we're seeing in our footprint. And that's really driven by our members in our states. And a key pillar of that is what we call our long-range transmission planning effort. And so that's how do we look at this resource fleet change as a footprint as a whole, and try to identify that regional transmission that can really form that highway to ensure we can do that in a reliable, cost-effective way, and looking at that as a region as a whole. Given while each utility, each state may have some distinctions in the policies and goals they're trying to meet, at the end of the day, we operate as one region, one RTO. And so how do we ensure that we're able to operate efficiently, reliably as that one RTO? And so going back to 2020, we started on this journey with our long-range transmission planning effort. And given that we're a very large footprint, we've broken this up into chunks of how we're going to look at our our footprint between our Midwest and South. And so I'll focus today on some of the things that are going on in our Midwest footprint, but we also are going to continue this journey over a number of years going forward to look at our South footprint and our footprint as a whole. So what I wanted to share here, I could spend, all day really going into detail how we got to our first large portfolio that we wrapped up last year. For those that have seen, we call it our Tranche 1 portfolio. It was 18 projects that covered our Midwest portion of the footprint, about $10 billion of transmission investment, over 2,000 miles of new or upgraded 345 kV transmission. I could really spend all day talking through all of the steps we went through to ultimately get the support and approval of that. But at a high level, this 7-step process here that I have on this slide really lays that out, that process that we followed for Tranche 1, the process that we're continuing to follow in our Tranche 2 effort that we're right in the middle of. And I would say too that while you look at the individual steps, there's some distinctions in what we do for each study, depending on the planning objectives we're trying to meet and the studies we're trying to do. But at a high level, this is a process MISO has been following really since 2007. So those that may be familiar with the 2011 multi-value projects that MISO approved back then, it followed essentially the same process. Some of the details, like I said, were different, but this is a 7-step process that we've really refined with our stakeholders and states and have had a lot of success in getting that large regional transmission identified and built that we all need across the system. This really, the fundamental piece that it all starts with is, what is the future we're trying to plan for? So we call it, not creatively, we call it our futures. And so there are really multiple scenarios where we're trying to look 20 years out into the future, or what are our members trying to do? What are our state's goals? And what's going to be needed to meet that? So what is the set of resources that's going to ensure from an energy adequacy, resource adequacy, also trying to think about it from a cost perspective. What's based on the technology that we have, what's the least cost way to achieve that? And so we lay out a 20-year expansion that builds off of what our members have said they're going to do. And then also we look at forecasting, okay, we know our members have X% of load growth or have these decarbonization goals. What additional resources are they going to need? And then that 20-year expansion of resources really is the foundation to that whole planning study. So we take those future scenarios, and I don't want to short cycle the extensive amount of kind of stakeholder back and forth that goes into developing those futures before we even get into the model building and planning process. And so this whole process has a really extensive, and Lauren's involved in all of those steps, a very extensive stakeholder process that we go through to get to that ultimate product that ultimately our board approves. I will say that if you looking back to the LRTP process that we finished last year, we had workshops, and the attendance on those was the highest we see really in any of our stakeholder forums. We'd average over 400 participants in those. So it really just speaks to the interest, importance of the work we're doing. And so we really value that input that we get in those discussions. But after we get through the futures, we go through multiple steps. Obviously, like I said, those futures are the foundation of everything we do going forward. So we'll build our models off of that we use in our economic analysis, our reliability analysis. And then all of that's used to say, okay, what issues are we trying to fix in that system when we look 20 years ahead to make sure the resources, we can use those resources and ensure reliability with load. And so those models we build, we really go through a refinement of plugging in different transmission solutions and seeing how those address those issues. And then we go through a whole iterative process to say, how do we optimize those? We get stakeholder input on different alternatives. And then we ultimately decide, okay, here's our preferred portfolio. Now, once we get there, one of the things that's really, I mentioned this, was demonstrating the benefits of this transmission. And also Rich picked up on a point that we struggle with today too, is how do you monetize, for example, all the reliability issues that transmission is providing? That is something we still struggle with. So when you think about a NERC reliability study, for example, it's kind of a binary decision, right? You have your NERC criteria, you identify an issue or an overload in your system, and NERC says, well, you got to fix that. Well, you don't have to go and build a business case to show the monetary value for fixing that issue. That's something that you have to do. So when we're doing these studies, there's things that are easier to quantify and put a monetary value on. And then there's things like, we're addressing all of these NERC reliability issues, but what's the dollar value on that? So when we are building the business case for the transmission, we try to really hit on both of those, looking at the NERC reliability issues, and then also trying to quantify multiple different types of benefits that transmission can provide. And I'll give some more examples in detail of what are those different types of benefits that we try to actually put a monetary value on for transmission. There's general agreement that this kind of regional transmission provides multiple different types of benefits, from your market types of benefits, congestion reduction, resource investments, like making more efficient resource investment decisions, decarbonization types of benefits, resiliency types of benefits. So there's general agreement on multiple types of benefits. Where the real debate gets into is what's the actual methodology assumptions that you're making to calculate those benefits. And so that's a step 2 in the process, where we have to spend a lot of time making sure our stakeholders understand the methodologies and get a chance to provide input into that. And then as this chart shows, the end step of this process is around applying a transmission cost allocation to that, which it's the end step of the process, but by far the most challenging piece of the puzzle is getting to that agreement around who's benefiting and who's paying for these projects. And Rich mentioned in his opening comments about different approaches to cost allocation, of whether it's an ex ante approach or an ex post approach, right? Where do you identify your cost allocation up front for certain types of projects, right? Projects that are meeting these drivers, have certain criteria. For those projects, we apply this cost allocation to those. Or do you wait until you have your set of projects and then start having that negotiation around the transmission cost allocation? So in MISO, the way we've approached cost allocation is to try to get to that ex ante cost allocation. And so have those debates and discussions with our stakeholders up front, including our states, our key partners in that discussion, having that up front and deciding on an ex ante basis for projects that are addressing reliability, market benefits, or multi-value projects, what's the cost allocation going to be for that up front, so that we can avoid those debates as we get to the end of the planning study. And so really that's kind of a high-level overview of the 7-step process that MISO follows in our planning for long-range transmission planning, and one that we've used in the past as well. So digging a little deeper into transmission cost allocation. So as I've mentioned, MISO's approach to cost allocation historically has been to define different project types depending on what issues those projects are addressing, whether it's a NERC reliability study, it's a new interconnection request and the upgrades that are associated with that, market efficiency type projects, ones that are very focused on relieving congestion on the system. And then the one we'll deeper dive into today is what we call our multi-value projects. And again, as the name says, these are large regional projects that are providing multiple types of benefits that can run the gamut of addressing reliability, economic, and public policy issues. And so as we apply our planning process in MISO, once we identify the projects, we'll look at what are the drivers of those projects, who is benefiting, to determine really what bucket, what project type under MISO's tariff should apply from a cost allocation perspective. And so this lays out here all of those different project types that MISO has in our tariff. And then it kind of runs the gamut of projects that are allocated very locally to ones that have a broader spread of costs similar to the spread of benefits. So if you think about the ones that are more local, which is on our left side here, those projects really are your local reliability types of projects, from addressing NERC reliability issues to maybe other TO driven criteria or upgrades that we're doing, from thinking about agent conditioning, for example. Obviously, our transmission system has a lot of components of it that is very old, and so there's always upgrades that TOs are doing to replace those lines, and so those fall into what we call our other bucket. And the way the allocation here says 100% to a local zone to load. The way to really think about that is MISO's local zones are utilities. So that's really your local utility where those costs are allocated. And then one of the other, thinking about the generator interconnection project, that was one item that I wanted to make sure to highlight, and Lauren can also speak to this, is as we're having these cost allocation debates on these new large regional projects and this resource change that's happening, there's always a lot of debate about what portion of that should be paid by load and what portion of that should be paid by generators. That's definitely an item that we still have a lot of differing opinions on, of where we've landed for MISO between what portion of the costs are paid by load and paid by generators. So currently in MISO generator interconnection projects that you see here in the middle, it's pretty much 100% of that is going to the interconnection customer. There is a small portion of those costs that for very large upgrades, 345 kV and above, 10% of that ultimately gets shared across the footprint. But predominantly those generator interconnection upgrades are paid by generators. Now, when you look at our multi-value projects, which is shown here on the right side, those are 100% to load. So there's a lot of debate about, well, should some share of those costs that is going to load through our multi-value projects, should some portion of that be allocated to generators? Knowing that they're benefiting too from those projects via potentially lower network upgrade costs. And so one of the way we've tried to make sure that folks think about that is you have to think holistically about what costs are being allocated to load and what costs are being allocated to generators, and finding that balance. So when we think about the planning process for identifying multi-value projects, we don't fix every single issue that we see in the models. So there's a number, we're focused more on laying out that regional highway set of transmission versus interconnecting every single resource that we've identified in our futures. So we know too that there's going to be some uncertainty where exactly resources are going to locate. And so what we do is we lay out the highway as part of our multi-value project planning process, knowing that when those resources actually go through the interconnection process, that's where they'll identify those more discrete upgrades that give them basically the on-ramps, right? So we try to think about it as MISO's, the MVP process is laying out the highway, where the local interconnection customer will, through the interconnection process, will pay for and identify the on-ramps to get onto that highway. And then two, our annual MTEP process will identify those off-ramps, more local projects via load. And so we try to remind folks to look at it really holistically of how are those costs being allocated to generators and load. But I will say, and Lauren knows this very much, that there's still very much differing opinions on that. Okay. So just to highlight, focusing on our multi-value project type there on the right side of this slide. Given the next few slides is going to go into some more detail around that project type in particular. And the reason I wanted to focus on that one is that's the one that we're using in our long-range transmission planning process. So that study, the projects that are coming out of that are being approved and evaluated under the multi-value project type that's in MISO's tariff. So I wanted to spend the time here focused on that. I will say, so for this multi-value project type here, this is a project type that MISO's had in our tariff. We first took this to FERC back in 2010 for their approval, and that the project type that they approved at that point. Remember, MISO's footprint prior to 2013 looked different. So prior to 2013, MISO was essentially what we are in our Midwest subregion today. The MISO South, as we call it, which is Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, wasn't part of the MISO footprint at that point in time. So the tariff that FERC approved at that point, it was essentially a system-wide, footprint-wide cost allocation. So we would identify a portfolio of transmission, show the benefits spread across that across the footprint, and allocate the cost to load in that same region. Now, as we started approaching this long-range transmission planning effort in 2020, with the expectation that we were going to use our multi-value project tariff, we knew that getting to a footprint-wide portfolio where you're able to demonstrate footprint-wide benefits to support that footprint-wide cost allocation was going to be very challenging. And then also, we had this sense of speed that we wanted to get through the study. So we knew that there was going to be benefits in, from a speed perspective in breaking up the footprint. So we started to think through what changes to that existing multi-value project tariff would we want to implement, kind of reflecting how the footprint had changed since 2010. So we started that discussion with stakeholders in 2020. It went on for probably a little over a year, looking at different approaches to modifying the multi-value project cost allocation and method. And ultimately where we ended up was we're going to bifurcate the MISO footprint. So it's a sub-regional approach, because if you think about the MISO footprint today, people like to refer to it as an hourglass, right? When you think about the interconnection between MISO's Midwest and South, it's essentially a single transmission line. That's a different debate of how we ended up there, but it's essentially a single transmission line that connects the MISO Midwest and MISO South. And so when you think about how to demonstrate the spread of benefits, having basically those physical system limitations really does limit the spread of benefits across the footprint, and really makes, if you're trying to apply a footprint-wide cost allocation, getting to that, roughly commensurate standard. So ultimately what we filed with FERC was adding the option of a sub-regional MVP cost allocation, based on the projects that you are approving, what are the spread of those benefits? And so if the spread of those benefits are predominantly to a single sub-region, well, it would make sense to just allocate the cost to that same sub-region. So essentially we added the option here that we call the MVP sub-regional option, to say that if the benefits are to one sub-region, then you allocate those costs to that same sub-region. And so that was really the one enhancement that we've made to the MVP tariff since FERC approved this in 2010. So other than that, there hasn't been any other changes to that methodology. So I've been talking about subregions. I mentioned pricing zones. Just to give some background, in MISO, we have a lot of different zones that we use in different processes that applies as well to transmission cost allocation. So I thought I'd make sure that to just touch on how those are defined in the MISO footprint. So we got here a map of the entire MISO footprint. And when I was talking about those MISO subregions that we use in the MVP cost allocation, this really illustrates that hourglass of the MISO footprint and how we've broken up those subregions where, one subregion is MISO Midwest, which is these zones 1 through 7 that we have in the north portion of our footprint. And then we have a MISO South subregion for zones 8 through 12. And so that's the configuration that we use for multi-value projects, and how we look at really defining those portfolios in those subregions and showing that the benefits and cost are spread appropriately. Now, for other project types that I mentioned, like the reliability projects, and I mentioned pricing zones, those are really basically utilities. So, for example, transmission pricing zones, you can think of utilities like Xcel or Ameren or ITC in Michigan, and those are really how we define the pricing zones. And so those are the most granular, or the smallest zonal level that we use in cost allocation, and that's predominantly what we use for baseline reliability projects, around reliability projects for NERC. And then those transmission pricing zones, we gather those in for certain types of projects, like market efficiency projects. We'll use what we call cost allocation zones. And those are really the best way to think about a cost allocation zone in MISO is following state boundaries. So that's what we have shown here is our cost allocation zones, and show how those generally follow state boundaries, whether Indiana or Illinois. And then at the same time, we also use cost allocation zones, and I'll have a chart on this in a few slides to show how we show the spread of benefits. So we talk about multi-value projects, we allocate those costs across the whole subregion. Well, how do we show regulators, how do we show our members that while we showed benefits to a whole region, how do we show the benefits to individual states? And we ultimately use these cost allocation zones that are shown here to really help support the business case to individual states of, well, okay, here's the benefits you're getting, and showing that the benefits are in excess of cost. So really, it's just the best way to think about is these zones go from utility to state to broader regions of the MISO footprint. Okay. So getting into some more details around the MVP tariff, I wanted just to kind of give an overview of some of the criteria of how we determine, do these set of projects meet the criteria that's in the tariff for multi-value projects, and how do we, what specificity do we really have in the tariff to define these projects? So I mentioned MISO likes to approach cost allocation from a ex-ante approach, where we try to put as much definition in the tariff to say, here's the criteria, here's what these projects look like, here's the benefits that you would use for these projects. And then for those projects that meet all of these criteria, here's the allocation that you apply. So I wanted to give a little overview of what's in the tariff to really help spell some of that out. I will say, from our experience around ex-ante cost allocation approaches, is you want to find that balance of putting enough definition in the tariff to clearly articulate what is the requirements to allocate the cost of this project. But at the same time, you do want to have some flexibility, so that you, at the end of the day, are not constantly going back to FERC and asking for approval to make changes, or to get approval for specific projects, because the more you have to do that, the more it looks like an ex post style cost allocation. So for multi-value projects, I know there's a lot of words here on this slide with the criteria, and this is really pretty much verbatim from the tariff, so I will not read these to you. But really, what the best way to think about these three criteria is, these are really the three fundamental criteria that determines, do you have a portfolio of projects that meets the multi-value project definition? And so we wanted to put three in there. It's not that a portfolio of projects has to meet all three of these. It has to meet one of these to be considered a multi-value project. And we wanted to put 3 in there to really reflect, again, that flexibility that depending on the planning study, depending on the drivers, you could have different objectives that you're trying to achieve. And so this criteria here tries to capture that. And criterion 1 here, this is really driven by public policy. Do you have projects that are really reliably, cost effectively addressing public policy that's in the MISO footprint? That essentially that's what that first criteria is. And then second criteria, that's really focused on economic value. So do you have a set of transmission projects that you're able to quantify multiple types of benefits where you have benefits in excess of costs? And that's focused on those economic benefits. And then criterion 3 is one that takes both economic and reliability. So do you have a set of projects that are addressing reliability issues and then also have economic value that you're able to quantify in excess of costs? So since MISO's had the MVP tariff, I mentioned we originally, FERC approved this in 2010. We've had 2 large portfolios that we've approved under the MVP tariff. The first one that we approved in 2011 was approved under criterion 1. So that portfolio of projects was really driven by a number of our states that started passing renewable portfolio standards. And so that set of projects was really to address how do we, reliably and cost effectively integrate all of those new wind resources that are being put in place to meet those state renewable portfolio standards. And so we approved the first portfolio under that criterion 1. Now the tranche 1 that we just approved last year, we approved that under criterion 3. And so I'll show you in some more detail both the benefits case that we used for that tranche 1 project, where we were able to show over multiple types of benefits, benefits in excess of cost. And ultimately we recommended to the board under criterion 3. So again, I think this is a good example of how you want to find balance in putting enough definition specificity in your tariff on the criteria to qualify as a project, but at the same time, giving yourself some flexibility in how you apply it. Okay. So going into a little more detail on some of the specific requirements that are in the tariff, I'll just kind of go through these relatively quickly. One of the key ones here on the left, on the lower left side, about must be evaluated as part of a portfolio of projects. So remember that when I was talking about the cost allocation for multi-value projects, there's either a footprint-wide allocation or a sub-regional allocation, but in the MISO footprint, even sub-regional is multiple states, right? Still large geographic areas that you are allocating these the cost of these projects to. So as we were going through the FERC process back in 2010, in our filing, we talked about how these projects were going to be studied and evaluated basically as a portfolio. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is if you're going to ensure that you have broadly spread benefits to support the cost allocation, you're also going to need a broad portfolio of projects. That just kind of logically makes sense. But also, when you think about the network benefits of very large transmission, you're not going to break it up into chunks, right? You're going to need really that portfolio across the footprint to get all of those benefits. If you think about transfer capability, being able to move power from one portion of a footprint to another, you're going to end up looking at it as a portfolio. And so ultimately FERC said, well, if you're going to study it and evaluate it, why don't you make that a requirement that you really need to look at these as a portfolio? And so that's one of the requirements, is that we study this as a portfolio of projects. Now, given that these are going to be large extra high voltage transmission projects, we did put in a couple of minimum thresholds around cost and voltage. So we do have a minimum project cost of $20 million. In today's prices, We haven't adjusted that since 2010, so that doesn't get you very far in transmission costs, but that is what we have. And then there's 100 kV and above voltage threshold. I mean, 100 kV and above is bulk electric system minimum level there, so not necessarily a big restriction. And then we do, so I talked about in the previous slide about the different criterion 2 and 3 about, showing benefits in excess of cost. You have to quantify that economic value. We do have a minimum BC ratio for both of those criterion 2 and 3 of 1.0. And then the tariff goes into some more detail saying you'll look at benefits over a 20-year time frame. This is the 20-year time frame that we have specified in the tariff is another item that we have debates on whether 20 years is being overly conservative. Because you think about transmission, these lines are going to be in service for much longer than 20 years. So there is an argument of, well, you should look at value over 40 years. But right now, the way it's defined in the tariff is 20 years. That's part of our trying to manage some of that uncertainty concern that stakeholders have about how do you manage that in your benefit cost calculation. So one of the ways is looking at it over 20 years versus 40. We also we're doing these on a present value term. So there's a discount rate component of these present value calculations. As an economist, I could spend a lot of time debating what's the appropriate discount rate, but the one that we use here is a risk-adjusted discount rate to try to, again, part of that's to capture some of that uncertainty as we're looking and forecasting benefits 20 plus years out. Okay. So that's really the different kind of criteria that we have for the multi-value project tariff. When it comes to benefits, I'll give you the examples that we used in tranche 1, but I would say that the benefits that we have in the tariff for multi-value projects, we do list benefits that can be considered. But again, to get to that flexibility, we also say that there can be other benefits that are considered as part of your evaluation, subject to working through that with the stakeholder process. So it's not that the multi-value project tariff says you can only look at benefits A through D when you're doing your evaluation. It does list out benefits that you can consider, and then it says, to the extent you develop others with stakeholders, those can also be considered in the evaluation. So that helps balance some of that flexibility. So when it comes to the actual cost allocation for multi-value projects, the multi-value project method, cost allocation method and recovery, rate recovery is, I would say, novel in the industry. So when you think about transmission rate recovery, it's almost always based off of demand, right? You look at peak demand, whether it's monthly or yearly, and that's how you charge for transmission. For most of transmission recovered in MISO, that's the way it's done. It looks at loads monthly peak demand, and there's a associated dollar per megawatt rate that's applied to it. Now, when we started developing the multi-value projects, when we thought about the renewable portfolio renewable portfolio standards that we were trying to meet, those are all energy driven, right? They're about serving a certain amount of energy to meet those RPS standards. And so we started thinking about, well, these projects look different than your traditional reliability project that's about serving peak demand. And so we started exploring an energy-based charge for these transmission lines. And then we also thought about it from a perspective of, well, this transmission is really providing value in a lot more hours than just at peak, which is traditionally what your reliability projects are about, is maintaining reliability during peak demand times. And really multi-value projects is about providing value in all hours of the year. And so we thought too, an energy-based charge made more sense to really capture that as load is withdrawing energy, they're getting benefit from that transmission and all of those hours. So shouldn't you you base your charge on energy versus demand. So ultimately, that's the direction we went. The 100% of the cost or MVPs are recovered on energy withdrawals. And another piece of that is that share that load pays is not fixed when the MISO's board approves that. So a lot of times for most transmission projects, especially in MISO, when the board approves it, basically each pricing zone, as I've referred to earlier, or utility, they know what their share of those costs are going to be, right? We'll say utility X is going to get 10%, utility Y is going to get 20%, and they're paying those costs for the life of the project. They're always going to pay that share of 8% or 10%, and it's not going to vary based on their load. They're always going to pay that fixed percentage. Well, we thought, well, for the multi-value project, is there a way to be more dynamic in that really load ratio share allocation to capture how things change over time? We know that we don't have a perfect model in forecasting benefits and usage 20 years out. So is there a way to set up the rate recovery that allows for a more dynamic capturing of how people are using the system? And then also you can, think about it from usage equals benefits. So if you're withdrawing more energy, you're using the transmission system more, you're getting more benefits, you should pay a greater share. So the way we set up the usage rate calculation for MVPs is essentially each month we reset what everybody's paying from a load ratio share basis, because each month we look at what were the actual energy withdrawals across the MISO footprint. So you could think about it from the perspective of, everybody's paying, which is the formula in the middle here, the MVP usage rate. Everybody's paying the same dollar per megawatt hour for each megawatt hour that they withdraw, but it actually depends on their total charges depend on their total withdrawals, and not just a fixed percentage of the project costs. So I like to think about this example that, if you think about the electrification that's happening across the system, if you would have a utility that would move up the electrification curve much quicker, they get a lot more electric vehicle penetration than a neighboring utility. Well, their share of MVP costs is going to go up because of their usage due to the electric vehicle usage. They're benefiting from the transmission system, so they should pay for that. And so that's another way to have a more dynamic cost allocation than a really fixed percentage up front. And from my experience, an energy-based charge for transmission isn't one that's broadly used in other areas of the country. All right. And I know I'm probably already overstepped my half hour. So I just have a couple more slides that am I good? Okay. So what I wanted to highlight here is, and I mentioned this earlier, is one of the key pieces in getting support for the cost allocation is, you have your ex-ante method of here's what the criteria is, here's what the cost allocation is going to be. But to get support for that ex-ante method, there really also has to be support in the planning process that's going to be used to identify those projects. So there has to be, agreement and confidence in the planning process to support that initial cost allocation approach. And so for tranche one, here's an example of the different benefits we looked at. So we looked at 6 different benefits and quantified that value for the whole portfolio. We went through a long process with stakeholders of what is the different value we're trying to capture, how are we calculating that, and to get that support for the overall business case for the portfolio of transmission. Now this is looking at the whole subregion as a whole, saying, okay, for the portfolio as a whole across that subregion, here's the benefits of this set of transmission across these multiple components of congestion relief, more efficient resource investment, whether that's actual generators or transmission, avoided risk of load shedding, some of that trying to capture some resiliency benefits, and decarbonization. And so we calculate that as for the whole footprint to show we got benefits in excess of costs. But the next important question when it comes to state regulators is, okay, that's great. You were able to show for the portfolio as a whole across the whole subregion that benefits are in excess of costs. How's my state customers benefiting? And so that's the next piece of the puzzle here in our business case, is making sure we go to that next level of granularity on benefits and costs to say, okay, here's each state's benefits. And so we break this down. We call them our cost allocation zones, but it's really state-based. And here's how that breaks down for each of the states. Again, to show that we have benefits in excess of costs for each of those areas that are going to be asked to pay for this. And between those two pieces, those are key pieces of the ultimate business case and getting support from our members and state regulators before we go to the board and ask them to approve it. So that's a really quick, a lot of information and a quick synopsis of our MISO's multi-value project planning and cost allocation approach. And I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to give more of the color on the negotiation process that happens on getting to the agreement on these things.
Great. Lauren, just before you begin, I'll just reiterate to participants, if you are like me, you're in sponge mode, you're soaking it up. Maybe the questions you want to ask of Jeremiah are going to start percolating up. Please feel free to use that Q&A function. And after Lauren's presentation, we can open it up and have a little dialogue. Thank you, Jeremiah. Great presentation.
All righty, hold on a second. I'm going in to speaker mode. Hi, everybody. It's Lauren Azar. And as was mentioned at the beginning, when I was a public service commissioner, I led the process at both two different processes that resulted in the MVP tariff. And one was just the regulators. So we worked with the 13 states and Canadian province to come up with near consensus on the cost allocation for those multi-value projects back in 2011. And then also I led the process at MISO where all of the stakeholders were involved. These negotiations happened over 18 months and we were meeting with either one or the other groups about every other week. So it was a pretty onerous process. I can say that I don't think anybody would have guessed where we were going to end up when we started the process, because we were designing a very different kind of cost allocation through those 18 months. And I'll talk about that in a minute. All right. So before we start, I just want to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. We are talking about a regional backbone grid. So these are extra high voltage lines, probably 230 kV and above. I want to emphasize that the asset lives of transmission are usually 60 to 80 years. And I'll get back to that in a moment, because as Jeremiah said, they only evaluate the cost savings for the first 20 years. And these big lines, what I'm discussing are lines that either cross state lines or in some cases interregional lines. But the MVP lines that were done back in 2011 were interstate lines, all within the RTO of MISO. So I had a blast sitting back and thinking about what were the key components of being able to get 11 of the 13 regulatory bodies to agree with the cost allocation and how we got stakeholders to buy in. And this is what I came up with. I'm sure there were more reasons, but anyway, I was pretty insistent that the regulators were engaged in the negotiations. So I wanted the parties that had essentially negotiating power sitting at the table as we were learning about both the planning process and the cost allocation process. Staff was there as well, but for the most part, we had the regulators at the table for those meetings. Bottom line, and early on, we agreed on some fundamental facts, and I'll be talking about some fundamental facts that if I had to create them today, I would be proposing to the regulators. you need to recognize that the people sitting at the table, both you have shared goals with some of them and you've got conflicting goals with the other. That's the reality. And you're trying to devise a compromise that works for everybody. And as I talk to other people about cost allocation, on some level, I say 70% of this is compromise and 30% is based on the technical components of it. The understanding the tools and even more importantly, the limitations of those tools is critical, because you need to understand what the tools are able to tell you and what they don't tell you. And we're going to talk about that today. Think long-term, think assets 60 to 80 years. And you need, as Jeremiah pointed out, you need to have relative confidence in the planning. Now, some people want perfect planning. You're not going to get that. You're not going to get everybody agreeing with the planning process, but you've got to have relative confidence in the planners that they are designing the grid that you want to have designed. All right, so why is agreement so elusive? That's what we're going to talk about first. As Rich said, the FERC mandate to get a cost allocation is you got to design something that is roughly commensurate. The costs are roughly commensurate with the benefits over the long term. Obviously, it's easier to calculate the costs of a transmission project than it is to essentially evaluate how much cost savings you're going to have from this line or portfolio of lines. And as Jeremiah mentioned, some of the benefits provided by these lines or portfolio of lines cannot be actually calculated. So what do you do in that situation? Bottom line is the disputes over cost allocation usually focus on the benefits, and they focus on how when you are monetizing benefits, how those benefits are calculated, and whether or not the tools are actually providing you with enough of a window into the actual full stream of benefits coming out of that transmission line. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Wanted to also note that when we're talking about benefits are used in at least two different ways. Number one, they're used to calculate benefit to cost ratio, which is oftentimes applied when you're determining whether or not a project qualifies for the distribution of costs over a number of beneficiaries. Benefit metrics are then also used in essentially distributing the cost to the different beneficiaries. And they're usually the same set of metrics, but they are not always the same. And as an example, the MISO MVP usage rate, or the MUR, does not use benefit metrics because it's allocated based on usage, just as an example. Okay, let's talk about the limitation of the current tools. And I do want to say that, golly, I wish we had the tools that could granularly evaluate all of the cost savings that customers receive from regional backbone lines. But the reality of the situation is we don't. And there's really two different limitations right now with the tools that we have. Number one, the power flows are changing all of the time over the grid. And when you're talking about a regional grid, you can have some pretty big swings in those power flows over, I'm going to use 60 years for the asset life of a transmission line. You can have, pretty big swings, which means the benefits flowing from a specific project or, a portfolio of projects can swing a lot over the 60 years. In fact, it's swinging minute by minute. We don't have the tools right now that allow us to easily calculate that. Now, one of the beauties of the MVP usage rate is that it does account for changes in benefits from the power flows over time. So, but I'm going to put that aside for right now. But right now we don't have tools like that you can start off and calculate in advance how specific beneficiaries are going to benefit over time given the change in flows. The second thing that's a problem is the metrics that we use to measure the savings that are received by customers are quite narrow. And, Jeremiah mentioned 6 of them. We debate over the specific formulas for those 6. We debate whether all 6 should be applied. There's no lack of debate at MISO over that. It continues to this day. But the bottom line is those metrics that can monetize savings don't capture all of the benefits that are flowing from a specific regional backbone line or a portfolio of lines. And I'm going to give one very specific example coming from Winter Storm Uri. So Winter Storm Uri hit the MISO South area. There are lots of calculations as to just how much money customers lost. But I'm going to say around the middle of the range is $200 billion was lost over about a 10-day period. And hundreds of lives were lost as well. If we had a robust regional grid that was resilient and could have accessed generators outside of that specific area that had sub-zero temperatures, those losses would not have been incurred by the customers. So that's a perfect example of benefits flowing from a strong regional backbone grid that cannot be calculated today. So let me first just summarize the implication, the limitations we have, and then we'll talk about the implications of that. Current tools only have a narrow set of metrics to essentially calculate the savings received by the customers. We know there are many benefits coming from the new lines that cannot be monetized. And the benefits change over the 60 years or 80 years of the asset life. I do again want to point out that as an example, MISO only calculates when it's trying to figure out if a project qualifies, and it says what the savings are that the customers are going to receive. MISO's only looking at the first 20 years of that. And so we know there's going to be another 40 to 60 years of benefits flowing to beneficiaries from that specific line or a portfolio of lines that aren't being counted in the calculations for the benefit to cost ratio. And honestly, I think that's a wise position to take by MISO. I mean, I wish they would use 40 years, which I think is what SPP uses, but being conservative helps in convincing people that indeed these regional backbone lines are going to pay for themselves. And frankly, they're going to pay for themselves relatively quickly. Okay. So we had 13 regulatory entities sitting at the table, and we had hundreds, as Jeremiah noted, there's now up to 400 stakeholders listening for the LRTP lines, but we have lots of stakeholders in MISO, in MISO negotiating and discussing what should be the calculation for building this regional backbone grid. And this list here is the same one I talked about before, but I do want to talk about some foundational facts. And I want to be absolutely clear, this is my list of foundational facts. You guys are going to need to figure out your own list of foundational facts. But if I was starting this again today, this is what I, as a commissioner, would put out to see if my fellow commissioners in other states would agree to this. Number one, inaction is costing ratepayers a lot of money right now because we aren't building the transmission grid that allows us to access lower cost generators. And it's also not allowing us to build the grid that we need for what we know is going to be a very different kind of generation portfolio, both in type, location, and volume. Given the extreme weather, I talked about Winter Storm Uri, and that increasing adoption rate of wind and solar, geographic diversity becomes critical. So as noted with Winter Storm Uri, being able to access generators outside of that sub-zero area would have saved consumers a lot of money. In short, the regional backbone grid at this point has to be larger than the weather systems. The regional grid has to be larger than the weather systems so that you can access the generators that are outside your local weather system. All right. The limitations in our current tools really do limit our ability to meet the FERC roughly commensurate standard over the long term. Noting that the regional backbone grid is going to take years to build, and we don't have a lot of time, so we can't just sit back and wait. And you know, this last bullet is a hard one for everybody, because I know as a state regulator, I had to primarily focus on my state's benefits. So what were my customers getting? I had to protect them. And part of it is recognizing whenever you're looking at a regional backbone grid, and those benefits are changing over time, there are going to be some months where we're benefiting a lot. There are going to be other months where another state is going to be benefiting more than we are. And that's okay. I mean, I would imagine that the folks, you know, that got hit by Winter Storm Uri, you know, they recognized how hurt they were and wished that maybe they had a regional backbone grid that would have allowed them to essentially rely on their neighbors, because that's what we need to do at this point in time. All right, so at MISO, what we've investigated, and this is both from 2009 to 2011 when we came up with the first MVP tariff. Ironically, when we started off the negotiations for the long-range transmission planning process, the LRTP process, everybody said the MVP tariff was dead, that we weren't going to use the MVP tariff, and because nobody liked it. Well, at the end of LRTP Tranche 1, everybody, I think, recognized the limitations of the tools and said, you know what? That MVP tariff that we spent 18 months devising actually still works. And so the stakeholders, the regulators said, yep, it's enduring, we're going to use it. So the three possible ways in which, and I'm sure there are more, but what we looked at was a granular cost distribution that changes over time. So in other words, really come up with very specific benefit metrics that can calculate savings, and essentially, you know, you rerun those numbers every year, every third year, or whatever the case may be. That actually, during the process between 2009 and 2011, is precisely what we designed. Was a process that the granular cost allocation, the savings, were going to be trued up every 3 years, and the transmission owners ended up not liking that. So we ended up jettisoning that for the broadly spread overload over the entire region. The second option is what we currently have with the MISO MVP usage rate. It's a broad distribution of the costs, recognizing that, you know, they're changing benefits over time, and frankly, that the tools that we have to actually calculate the savings are narrow and aren't capturing all of the savings coming from those projects. So in other words, if you do a granular cost allocation, you're going to have free riders, and we're trying to avoid that with the MVP tariff. And then lastly, we're currently at MISO discussing a combination of 1 and 2. I like to call this the two-step, where you first calculate for those metrics that actually can calculate the savings, you calculate them, and then everything else would be broadly distributed over the load. Now, the trick on that is to get the ratios right, because, right, you want to make sure that only a small portion of the granular costs are applied to the overall costs. And, you know, given it's a regional backbone line, you want the broadly based distribution of costs to be a larger share of that. At least that's my personal opinion. So those are the combinations that we have and continue to investigate at MISO. The debate actually never stops, but I urge the regulators in the West to have patience. build trust among the negotiators, and work hand in glove with the planners so that you have the confidence in those planners. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Warren and Jeremiah. That was very interesting. And I think the MISO experience is something that I think people around the country are looking at. Figuring out, can they use that as a model for transmission cost allocation around the country? We don't have a lot of time, but there were a couple of questions that we got on the Q&A chat that I wanted to go through. Let's start with a question that came up for you, Lauren. And really the gist of the question is, what was the forcing mechanism that brought the state regulators to the table? Was it the fact that MISO was an RTO and you were worried about FERC was going to approve something, or MISO was going to do something that you didn't like, or was there some other reason that the states were actually able to come to the table and work their, at least 11 of the 13, work their issues out?
The whole MVP process was kicked off with a letter from the governors from 5 states who had renewable portfolio standards, and they recognized that the planning process at MISO was not going to enable their ability to meet those RPSs. And so MISO started with the planning for those states. And then the other states in MISO said, wait, we don't want to be left behind. And so they said, we want you to design the grid for us. So then MISO ended up combining the two and designing the MVP portfolio. So it was really kicked off by the renewable portfolio standards and the need to comply with those, which is why, as Jeremiah pointed out, that the MVPs in 2011 were based on criterion 1 in the MVP tariff.
So along those lines, I'm just curious, we see this in some other regions. PJM is a good example where some states are concerned that a lot of the transmission build is being used to satisfy the public policies of certain states, while other states don't necessarily have those same public policy goals. Did you find that as an issue in terms of the MISO discussions?
So it certainly wasn't with regards to the 2011 process. It has been raised in the LRTP process, but we are in a different world right now. In 2011, wind and solar were not the least cost resources, and now they are. And so just looking at pure economics alone is pushing the development of these resources faster than we can ever imagine. And well, I'll stop there. Jeremiah, I don't know if you've got anything else to add there.
The only thing I would add there is, while there's not universal agreement or universal public policy across the footprint, but that's where that economic value that comes into play. Like, while some of these resources that are coming online may be driven by certain states' public policy, here's the economic value that you can still get from that, as Lauren mentioned about the low cost energy that this provides. And so making sure that they understand the economic value that's available to their customers as well.
Jeremiah, we have a question that I thought was kind of interesting from the Oregon Department of Energy. The question is, does MISO evaluate on an ongoing basis its footprint to examine how it might be able to expand its footprint to address regional diversity and topology issues and so on in a way that actually might lower costs for everyone down the road? Or is it pretty much defined as it is and probably not going to expand?
So I wouldn't say we're in an active mode where we're kind of proactively reaching out to neighbors, but we do have conversations. If someone comes to us and asks about joining MISO, looking at some of those pros and cons, what's the value of them, both the value to them and the value to MISO customers. I would also, when I saw this question, I thought about it too of, yes, you can look at it from try to capture diversity benefits from actually expanding the MISO footprint. But too, MISO has an interregional component, right? We have partnerships with PJM, with SPP that we're doing studies with on a regular basis. So you can also capture some of that footprint diversity benefit through those processes without formally expanding MISO's footprint.
So there's another question, and this is, I think, for both you, Jeremiah and Lauren. And this has to do with kind of it's really a process question, you know. And Lauren, you mentioned it was where the state regulators were at the table, a lot of decisions were made among the state regulators. And how does that work with balancing the idea? And a lot of folks talk about transparency and having significant stakeholder participation in each region. How do you balance those issues?
So what we did back in between 2009 and 2011 is the regulators led. So we would have a meeting of the regulators, have a robust discussion there. Anybody could attend, but only the regulators could talk. And then 2 weeks later, we would have stakeholder meetings, and they were aware of what happened at the regulator meetings, but they would then debate it, and their information would be sent back to the regulators for the next regulator meeting. So I would need to look, but I think we were meeting about every other week with one or the other of the entities. And these were multi-day meetings.
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend that, by the way, but go ahead.
I was on that travel journey. I wouldn't recommend it either. Just to build the two with Lauren on the close relationship between allowing the state regulators to have the space for their discussions, but then two, in MISO, we have a robust stakeholder process as well. So how do you connect those? As Lauren said, we had those meetings kind of on a similar cadence. Also, Lauren was the chair of what we call our RECB working group, which is a stakeholder forum for cost allocation discussions, and we've continued that. So right now, the organization of MISO states, which is the body state regulators in MISO, are meeting and talking about transmission cost allocation. And then the chair of that committee is also the chair of our RECB working group in the MISO stakeholder process. So that's another way to keep that strong partnership with state regulators.
I don't know if we have any hands up. I know some of the state regulators, the CREPC member state regulators, state energy officials have been added as participants. Barring that, I do have I know we're close to the end of time, but I do have a question regarding how in terms of this the MISO experience, and that's really is it possible to be successful in an area that doesn't have an RTO? For instance, MISO had the organization of having an RTO being the regional transmission planning process, and you had, as Lauren, you mentioned, you had the organization of MISO states. The West, you have 3 different planning regions, California being an ISO, the other 2 planning regions are outside of the ISO process. Is it possible to achieve, both in terms of planning projects, but also achieve a cost allocation mechanism in a non-RTO region?
Yes. And here's how I would do it. If you have a set of congruent states that the regulators want regional grids, or their utility wants a regional backbone grid, those utilities and regulators can get together and come up with a design for the regional backbone grid amongst their states and how to pay for it. We saw in MISO, actually, even before the governors sent their letters back in 2008, a number of utilities in Minnesota, and I forget, North Dakota, Montana, got together and did exactly that. They said, we're going to build these lines together, and our regulators are going to figure out, we're going to figure out how to cost share it. So that was actually, I think that probably was another prompt for the governor letter. And Jeremiah, I don't know if you have a different answer, but yes.
Jeremiah, you agree?
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
I see we are running out of time. I did want to kind of ask if you had any parting thoughts. In particular, this whole process, as Matthew mentioned at the beginning, is really a process associated with CREPC, the state regulators, the PUC regulators, but also the state energy officials. If you have any other recommendations for the states as they're essentially embarking on a process of trying to figure out regional transmission planning and regional cost allocation, what they should be doing, how they should be positioning themselves. So I'll start with Jeremiah and then go to Lauren.
I think the key thing is as you're working through these discussions is not letting, the objective to try to find that perfect answer get in the way of actually making progress. These are long-term assets that there's always going to be some uncertainty. You want to minimize that, but you're never going to have perfect foresight. And so how do you come together as a group and have faith in, moving forward and making those decisions? And what is enough information to be able to move forward with that commitment?
And for me, I would say to regulators, don't underestimate the force of your soft power. So your ability to go to your utilities and say, look, we need for economic development reasons to ensure that we are able to access lower cost electricity. We do want a regional backbone grid. Utilities listen to that. So if you go and talk to them and say, we want that, figure out what utilities you need to work with and figure out how you're going to do the transmission planning. Without an RTO, that's one of the challenges, right? You're going to need to come up with a transmission planning process where all of the states that are involved in it and whose customers are going to be paying for it need to have confidence in that planning process. So I would put the onus on the utilities. Say, this is what we want, this is what we need. Utilities, you come back to us with a plan, and then we, the regulators, will help discuss developing the cost allocation. And I just want to thank everybody. This topic really excites me. So,
Lauren, your energy is infectious. Your positivity is very welcome and well timed. We really appreciate both you, Jeremiah, and Rich for the excellent moderation and setup, for all the insight and expertise and good energy you've shared with us today. On behalf of the whole GridWorks team, very much appreciated. I also want to acknowledge a couple of folks, Kate Griffith, Serena Soar, Maggie Dunham-Jordahl, and Laura Rennick, without which this webinar would not have logistically ever come together. So we thank you all for your time and effort. Finally, the recording for this webinar and the slides will be posted on the GridWorks website. I shared the link in the chat bar. If you didn't get it, it won't be hard for you to find. Google will find you too. So we hope those resources will be an asset to everybody as they move forward. We'll be back in touch about next steps with this initiative and look forward to seeing you then. Take care now.